Good morning, afternoon, or evening, everybody, and welcome to Pangolin, the Conservation Podcast. I'm your host, Jack Baker, and welcome to the show which celebrates the incredible, amazing, wonderful conservation stories that inspire me, and I hope will inspire you too. This season, we are exploring the land of the lemurs, Madagascar, and on today's show, we are looking specifically at wildlife hunting with the incredible Hervet Randriamady of Maheri, Madagascar Health and Environmental Research. He's here to tell us about his work to do with wildlife hunting, but also its impact on wildlife and people and the kind of health aspects and the aspects that perhaps you wouldn't necessarily think of immediately when we think of wildlife hunting. And we even go into the realms of kind of mental health. And yeah, it's a really diverse and interesting discussion that I really hope you all enjoy. Now, during the course of the discussion, there are two types of animals brought up that we are yet to explore. So I thought it would be a good idea to introduce them now. The first of them are tenrecs, and tenrecs are hedgehog-like creatures, which, while looking like hedgehogs, are actually very, very different. They're more closely related to otter shrews and golden moles than they are hedgehogs, despite the fact they have the kind of classic spiny look that you would imagine a hedgehog having. Now, there are around 30 species of tenrec, and they are all evolved from one common ancestor. However, they are all pretty different now. There are some which climb trees, there are some which hide in the undergrowth, and there are some which can swim. Interestingly, though, they are all similar in one way, which is their size. They're very, very, very small. The largest only weighs about a kilogram. The tailless tenrec only weighs about a kilogram, so all very, very small animals. And kind of a fun fact for you to kind of help these animals stick in your head is that one species of tenrec, the lowland streaked tenrec, uses the sound produced when it rubs its spiny kind of quills together to communicate. So that's kind of an interesting fun fact about tenrecs for you. The other animal which we are going to be talking about is the fossa. And now, fossa, they look like cats, but they're actually evolved from kind of the same point as the mongoose. They arrived in Madagascar about 21 million years ago, and since then they have become the top predators, and they will hunt everything from lemurs to birds to fish to insects to small mammals. Sorry, tenrecs. Anything they can get a hold of, they will eat. Now, this is assisted by the fact they are very agile. They can climb trees, they have very sharp claws and these long tails, which help them to move around the forest very, very efficiently. And what's kind of interesting about them, and I didn't know, is that they will come together to mate and to raise the babies. The mothers will look after them, but apart from that, they like to spend their time alone. And to make sure they stay alone, they will mark areas with a very pungent odour to make sure that everybody else around about them knows this is my space, keep out. So, those are the two animals we are going to be talking about a little bit throughout the episode. They come up, and sadly, the reason they both come up is because they're affected by wildlife hunting, similarly to lemurs. Fossa are viewed as vulnerable on the IUCN Red List, and the 30 species of tenrec kind of range from data deficient, so we don't know enough about them to say, all the way up to endangered. So big concerns, very bad areas to be in. They're affected, as I've said, by hunting, but also similar issues to the lemurs, like habitat loss, things like that. So, yeah, animals that we should really be concerned about. And of course, if you love Madagascar like I do, you should be concerned about all of the things that live there, not just the lemurs. So, that's why we've kind of done this nice introduction for you. Anyway, now you know those two key players and hopefully have gained a little bit of a appreciation. You can Google them if you want to get a better idea, get a look at the photo instead of just my kind of rough descriptions of a hedgehog-like thing and a cat thing. You can go and Google those and have a proper look. But now that you know them, I will get on with today's interview. I really hope you enjoy it. Hervey provides some great insights, some things that I'd never thought about in relation to hunting, and yeah, I really, really hope you enjoy. I'll be back at the end of the episode to kind of wrap up, but for now, thank you so much for listening, and thank you for joining me as we explore the land of the lemurs. Thank you. Welcome back to the show. I'm now joined by Hervet Randriamady. Hervet is on the board of Maheri and researches wildlife consumption, environmental change, and human health. He's here to tell us a little bit about that today, so thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, thanks, Jack, for having me today. I think it will be a great podcast.
I wondered to start us off, if you could introduce yourself to the listeners and tell us a little bit about your background.
My name is Hervé, as you said. I'm from Madagascar, but I'm currently in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So I will be pursuing my PhD in nutrition at Harvard School of Public Health. I've been working with Madagascar health and environmental research for the last 6 years. So our research is mainly focused on the environmental change and human health. And we mostly work in northeastern part of the country. I did my bachelor degree in economics at the University of Antananarivo. And then I got a Fulbright scholarship from the US State Department that allowed me to continue my master in agricultural economics at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville.
Perfect. That's really interesting. And I guess before we talk about your work with Madagascar Health and Environmental Research, I wondered, just going off what you said there, what made you kind of want to go from economics into kind of human health? That seems like an interesting transition. What was it that made you want to kind of do that?
Actually, when I was at university, I've studied economics, but then my research thesis back in Madagascar was focused on agricultural economics. So it was focused on rice policy. And then I moved to the US, I was kind of interested on that specific applied economics where I could integrate environments on my study. So I was very how could you link environment and agricultural economics and how these things are interrelated. Also, food security really has an impact on the health of the people. When I was studying economics, we only study the part of in economic way, very focused how we'll solve things and it's supply and demand and what is the right price, right quantity. But we don't know to the people they will get the enough nutrient from those food they get. So that's something that the economy could not really resolve. So then when I went back to Madagascar after finishing my study in the US, I started working with Professor Chris Golden, who is the founder of Madagascar Health and Environmental Research, that
Mhm.
introduced me that concept of how health is related to social aspect of the life of the people. Because I visited the Maikiro Natural Park and I see how people there heavily really rely on food forests, on bushmeat consumption. So then I see that okay, I think I could bridge my knowledge from economy to nutrition to health and holistic, not only economic, could resolve the problem, to better understand the problem, for instance, of malnutrition and disease.
That's really interesting, and it kind of tells us how you got involved as well in Madagascar Health and Environmental Research because you met the founder there. What is it you do with them now, and what is it that the organization's kind of it's kind of there in the title, but what are the organization's research interests?
The organization research interest is based on our main interest is on intersection between environmental change and human health. So we study how for instance people rely on bushmeat consumption for their food. How does it affect their health? How food forests, for instance, affect their health. How, for instance, we also study fishery declines because we work in the Entongil Bay in the northeastern part of the country. So they are people that rely on fishery to get their protein. So we also study, for instance, how the fishery collapse because now we are experiencing that there is a decrease in fish catch and how those people that rely on those fishery, how this decline may impact their health in the future, because that's where they get their food for, especially the protein, and how that decline, for instance, impact their lack of specific micronutrients that could be only found in those fish, such as omega-3. So we know, like, we try to see that intersection between food, like climate change, and that kind of intersection. So that's the work we are doing. And currently, the work I've been working during the last 4 years, we have a project called community-based health surveillance. So we follow the health of roughly 1,000 of people living in the forest about their health on a monthly basis. And we ask about disease question. We do dietary intakes. We do anthropometric measurement. We also collect weather data, and we try to see how all of these factors are interrelated. So that's broadly the work we are doing. And maybe starting next year, we have a project in the southwestern part of the country where we plan to implement artificial coral reef. So in order to, to get to restore some of those coral reef that has been damaged by the environmental degradation, whether many people in that southwestern part of the country get most of their fish and the livelihood from coral reefs. So we try to restore those coral reefs in the southwestern part of Madagascar, and to see how the implementation of that new artificial coral reef could improve the nutrition of the people, the livelihood of the people, and the health of the people there.
That's absolutely fascinating. It's an interesting kind of intersection, as you say, because it's these issues that come together that are local issues but are affected by global actions, and these kind of macro actions that take place across the whole world also play into these smaller local community problems that it's a really interesting intersection to be studying. And there's so many things that you've mentioned there that I'd yes, I'd love to talk about more, and I think we will do as we go through the interview. But I guess to start us off, just to give the listeners some more context for what you were saying, in doing my research for this, you sent me a couple papers to read, and in one of them it talks about the fact that if wildlife was removed as a food option for the communities that you work in, there could be up to a 29% increase in the number of children suffering from anemia. And there could be a tripling of anemia cases among children in the poorest households. So it's a really serious, important issue. And I wondered, just to get us started, if you could kind of tell us and contextualize for the listeners, what are the kind of communities that you work in? What can you tell us about them to kind of base the conversation in?
Yeah. So we work currently in three communities. Most of them live around the Maikira Natural Park
Mhm.
and the Maswala protected area. Those are the two largest protected area in Madagascar. And there are many people that rely on bushmeat consumption in those areas because most of them are really poor. And it's not that they just want to eat bushmeat, but they don't have like the mean to purchase animal foods, sort of like a chicken or pork, but they have to rely on those bushmeat consumption to get their protein. So in those areas where they got most of the protein are from like bushmeat consumption, such as lemur, tenrecs, carnivorans, bush pig. So if research conducted by Christopher Golden, who is the founder of MAHER, Madagascar Health and Environmental, he found that if we remove bushmeat consumption on their dietary intake, they will be at risk of malnutrition. So now we can see how people in those areas heavily depend on bushmeat consumption to get their protein. So that's like now we can see how the intersection between environment and human health. So that's one of our research, as I said previously, that people rely on those forest food or animal resource food from forests to get over micronutrients, for instance, iron. so they could be healthy.
Hmm. That's interesting, and it's something that is interesting that they're kind of relying on these sources of food that are would perhaps be considered unusual to some people, but they are the only source of food for them. And I guess it might be unusual for some people listening that they go for these things that they have to rely on things that some people would think, oh, these are endangered species. How could they rely on them? But when it's your only option, it really does make sense that those are the things that you are going to use because they're there and you're able to use them. And before we move on to the animal side and kind of talking about the impacts on wildlife, I wanted to ask you, is there any negative impacts for people if they're relying on these sources of protein? Is there something, yes, are there negative impacts for them on relying on wildlife for their main sources of food?
Yes, one of the negative impact I would say is the zoonotic disease, because in those animals there are like many diseases that could be transmitted from animal to people.
Mm-hmm.
And but you know the thing is we are trying to identify like a win-win solution that will not place undue burden on local communities, because but still have a base objective of protecting biodiversity. So it's kind just unjust to force people to stop eating bushmeat when they rely on it for food nutrition. So what we're trying to do is like to create intervention and solution that allow people to choose something else
Mm-hmm.
over bushmeat like chicken. But again, I mean, the negative impact is zoonotic disease. And one of the research finding that we found, a research that I have the chance to lead with Cello Park, with Dana Moon and Gianna Armanana, and Christopher Golden, we found that once the environmental policy have been implemented in those protected area, people start relying on those like for food consumption for protein, because bats in those area are uh, are not illegal to hunt. So people start relying on those the bats, whoever bats is considered like has a lot of disease. And you know how the consequence of those environmental policy on the unexpected consequence of those environmental policy implemented in those area on their diet. People know that okay, they could not hunt lemurs, but then they know okay, we could still hunt bats, which is legal. And you can see how the consequence, for instance, on those environmental policy will have on their diet. So they will be more exposed to zoonotic disease, especially when consuming, for instance, bats.
That's yeah, it's awful because it's one of the you can understand why people would want to protect the lemur, but if there is then no other option but to go for something that is ultimately going to make you sick or potentially sick, it's yeah, you're stuck between a rock and a hard place there that you're going to have to act in a way and take that risk of the zoonotic disease transmission. That's yeah, not ideal at all. Yes, I don't really know where to take it from there because it's not good. And I wondered, I guess we'll talk about solutions in a while, but yes, just to kind of leave that floating with people for now, that's kind of the things that we're up against for on the human side. And something else that I know has been impacting the south of Madagascar. I know you have worked a lot in the northeast, and I don't know if it's as much of a problem there, but is the famine that is kind of happening in the south, is that something that is affecting the whole country and affecting the area where you're working as well?
I I've worked also in the southwestern part of Madagascar 3 years ago on malnutrition project. But compared to the people living in the south, I think people living in the northeastern part of the country where I work in Madagascar are better off in terms of food security, though there are malnutrition, but not like the famine, like severe malnutrition that you could see like in the south. I think that people in the northeastern part of the country are close to the forest, and there are lots of forests there, and they could get food from the forest compared to people in the southwestern part of the Madagascar or in the deep south of Madagascar, because there is a research stating that people living close to forests don't really experience food insecurity compared to people living really far from the forest. So that could be my assumption why people in that part experience less, how to say that, I mean, like food secure compared to people in the south. So
Mhm.
if I compare people in the deep south and people in the northeastern part of the Madagascar, I think people in the northeastern part of Madagascar are better off in terms of food security. Though again, we
Mhm.
still experience stunting there, wasting, but not like acute malnutrition or severe malnutrition,
Mhm.
like in the south part of the of the country.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing to see the different issues and yes, how they have to be dealt with in very, very different ways and how yes, I think a lot of people don't realize quite how big Madagascar is because it is an island. I think obviously people think, oh, it can't be huge, but it's a big island with a lot of people on it and it's a large space. So it makes sense that these issues are so varied and maybe have different severities in different regions. And as I said, we're going to talk about solutions to these problems and these kind of issues in a second. But before we get there, there is of course the other side of the equation and the other side of the coin, which is the impact on conservation and animals and lemurs and yes, all of the different species that are affected by wildlife hunting. And I wondered, we mentioned them briefly before, but could you tell us a little bit about some of the species that you've worked on that are perhaps being most greatly impacted by wildlife hunting?
Yes, I think currently in the northeastern part of the country, there are like 22 recognized lemurs, and some of them are critically endangered because of unsustainable hunting, deforestation, and climate change. And some of them are like most of the rough lemurs are critically endangered in this area. Also, like injury, that's like one of the famous lemurs in Madagascar. And there are also some carnivore species that also like people eat, which is part of their diet that also really endangered. So those are like species. Most of the lemurs found in the northeastern part of Madagascar are really threatened because of, again, it's not only from bushmeat consumption, but also from deforestation and climate change.
It's interesting to hear about the impact on lemurs, and we mentioned before tenrecs, and you mentioned their, and we've mentioned bats, and you mentioned they're carnivores compared to a lot of other places around that kind of. If you look at yes, if you look at that part, kind of that banding of the earth, there's to the left you've got Africa, which has things like lions and a lot of big cats. To the right on the map, you've got kind of Asia, which has tigers and these larger predator species. But Madagascar doesn't have many large carnivores that spring kind of immediately to mind. I wondered what kind of carnivores are we talking about here, just for the listeners to have some context.
The carnivore we are talking is the most famous one in Madagascar is the fossa.
Hmm.
His scientific name for it is Cryptoprocta.
Hmm.
So they are like a cat carnivore, but they are not really big. So those are like very mostly found in Madagascar. So that's the most famous
Hmm.
carnivores that found in the country, the fossa. They are also like other carnivores like Malagas civet. What else? Yes, so those are like a type of carnivores that they all look like a cat, not really big like a tiger or lion, but almost like the size of a huge cat that
Hmm.
you will see like in the street or in the house. So yeah.
Hmm. Interesting. And I guess their primary prey is lemurs and kind of animals around that size. Yeah.
Yes, I think they mostly hunt lemurs, but when they are close to some communities or village, they also like to prey like chicken, duck of the people. So people in the area where I work are really worried about like the fossa, those type of carnivore, because they sometimes stay not really far from the chicken or ducks. So they prey those animals for their food. But they mostly hunt lemurs, but they also hunt like a ducks, chicken, and yeah, something like that.
And I mean, it makes sense if there's people hunting wildlife, and they're kind of going for the same sources of protein, it makes sense then that when their protein, the things that they would normally hunt, like the lemurs, decrease in number, they would then go and find other sources of protein, which would be, of course, the chickens and the ducks and the things that people keep in the villages for themselves. And I wondered, just kind of that bridges the gap nicely into this kind of complicated situation, which is solving these problems because you have on one side critically endangered species, and then on the other side you have people who rely on these animals to survive, and finding the kind of perfect balance, as we talked about with the kind of policy to protect lemurs, can be quite difficult because you then have people shifting to eating bats, and then that increases the risk to them. It's a very, very complicated situation, and I wondered, how do you try how how do you begin to weigh human health versus animal protection? How do you weigh that? How does that equation work for you in your head? How does that work?
That's a really good question, and I think that's a false dichotomy
Hmm.
because we don't want to pit the two against each other. We want to create agroecological solution that
Hmm.
allow people to sustainably rely on their environment while protecting the forest and the people who live in it. So yeah, that's how I will answer that question.
It's a good answer actually. It's one of those things that, yes, I think a lot of people do think of these two spheres as very separate, but at the end of the day we do rely on one another. So it was the perfect answer, I think. And well, then I wonder, what are some of the solutions that you've worked on? What are the kind of ways that you try and create this kind of perfect circle?
Now, currently, we have a project called Village Poultry. We provide vaccination against Newcastle disease to some communities where we work to protect chicken from Newcastle disease. Why you may wondering why we choose chicken as an alternative source of protein for to protect the lemurs because when we did some research or survey, chicken is the most preferred taste of meat in those areas. So, okay, we decided that let's try to provide vaccination for people who raise chicken in those areas against Newcastle disease because Newcastle disease is one of the disease that kill most of the chicken in these areas. So they are more willing to raise chicken if they get that vaccination every 4 months. So that's something we do every 4 months in some communities in northeastern part of the Madagascar, in Makir and in the Mashwala. So we work with National Institute of Vaccine, veterinary vaccine in the capital of Antananarivo. And that project is led by Dr. And Miarfit. So they send a vaccine. That vaccine is very innovative because you don't need to freeze that vaccine. You can just bring that vaccine with you in those remote area. It doesn't require like a fridge. It will last like I think 3 weeks. So that's one of the solution that we have elaborated with the National Institute of Veterinary Vaccine in Antananarivo. So each each 4 months we go to the city, villages where we work. So we provide that vaccine. And just to clarify that vaccine only lasts for 4 months. So the immunity of the chicken will last 4 months. And after 4 months, they need to get another vaccine again. So that's one of the solution we do in the area where we work. In addition to that, I think one of our colleague, Courtney Borgerson, tried to have a her project is focused on edible insects. So in the place where she worked in Maswala Natural Park, they try to raise an insect that not a chicken but insect, and that insect is very nutritious. Nutritious. So they did a research on that insect, and they found that insect are really nutritious and could also address food security and wildlife conservation. And it has a high in macro and micronutrients. So recently, she published a research about the impact of that insect. I think The name of the insect is Zanama tenebrosa. I'm not really sure. I need to check the name, but they found that the food that people eat, become more diverse once they eat that edible insect, that part of their diet. So that's also one of the solution that one of our team member, led by Courtney Borgeson, do in the Mashwalana Protect National Park to address malnutrition. So yeah, those are like the two solutions that we do in the place where we work now.
It's a really clever idea to provide these alternative protein sources because not only does that then protect the wildlife, it removes the risk of zoonotic disease transmission because you're eating species or you're eating animals that are then relatively risk-free, I would imagine, of transferring these things to humans. So it's a good solution to kind of come up with, and it makes perfect sense when you say it and explain it. It's the obvious solution, I suppose, but sometimes that first solution is the best one. And I suppose something that you talked about there, and or kind of similar to what we've talked about there, and you mentioned it at the start, and I wanted to kind of go back on it because it was something that was really interesting to me was the providing alternatives or helping to reinvigorate fishing and fisheries as well. So not only do you have the protein from chickens and the protein from the insect, there's this other protein that you're providing to other communities in the form of fish. And I wondered, you talked about it briefly at the start, but could you tell us a little bit about that work?
Yes, so people living in the coastal area of Madagascar, especially like the people living in the southwestern part of Madagascar, rely heavily on seafood for their protein and for their livelihood. So one of the solution that I think like usually proposed is to have like a better fishery management plan, so we could get most of those fish back to their area. And I think those are like a solution proposed by many environmental like NGOs, like setting up a specific marine conservation plan in this area. For instance, at some part of the season, people not are not allowed to fish in order to get, like to increase the stock of the fish. So then, not only they will get more fish to eat, but also like they could sell some of those fish, get their income. So that's also like one of the solution how we that been proposed to restore or to get back some of those species that are also endangered in those area.
That's yes, that's really really interesting, and yes, something that I one of my first jobs was working kind of in an aquarium and telling people about fish and protecting the ocean. So it's always something that I had to ask about because it was something that really genuinely is very very interesting to me. And it's yes, it's interesting to hear about not just kind of stopping people from fishing, but the knock on effects of that are very impressive. At the start as well, you talked about coral reef restoration.
Mm-hmm.
And I wondered, what's that project about? How do you go about restoring a coral reef? That sounds fascinating as well.
Yes, we plan to install like by using like a new technology called autonomous reef monitoring structure. So these are artificial coral reef that we put in those areas. So we think that by installing those artificial reef, we will be able to regenerate the environmental biodiversity, marine biodiversity in those areas. So it will take many times, to get all of those maybe fish species or seafood species back in the area in order to really restore that ecosystem in those places. So that's one of the projects we plan to do, and we will compare how the impact by implementing those artificial coral reef in those areas will impact on the fish stock, on the regeneration of new species that could return, and we want to see how their fish catch will increase maybe after implementing these artificial coral reef. So we will compare with a place where coral reef, artificial coral reef are not implemented in order to see the impact of that artificial coral reef on their fish catch, on their livelihoods. And yes, that's something that we plan to see for the next 5 years.
It's fascinating, and it'll be interesting to track and kind of follow that work and see what happens and see what species do come back and what things change and how the communities also perhaps around the coast how they change and how they develop and how they kind of have this changing relationship with the reef. That will be really, really interesting to kind of follow. And yes, I will make sure to keep up to date with that because that's genuinely very, very interesting. Um, I wondered, we're kind of getting towards the end of the interview and all of the questions that I had. But before we go, I wondered, is there any projects that we haven't talked about yet that are you're extremely passionate about or you are extremely interested in that you'd like to talk about? Or is there any projects that, yes, you're especially interested in and would love to tell the listeners about?
Yes, oh, so it's still part of the implementation of the coral, artificial coral reef in the south. So my project in that project is to see how, for instance, the impact of biodiversity intake have an impact on the mental health of the people that living in that place. And we want to see if during the lean season, where people don't have enough food to eat, if they will experience more stress compared to the season where food are abundant. So, I want to see that kind of intersection between food intake, mental health, and environmental change. So that's a project that I will conduct, which is part of the implementation of the coral reef in the southwestern part of Madagascar. So that's still in its infancy. So that's one of the projects that I will be working in that part for the next 5 years.
Mhm.
Yeah, as a part of my PhD research project.
Mhm. That's absolutely incredible, and it'll be interesting because I think a lot of the time people think immediately about physical health and nutrition in terms of yes, in terms of kind of a very physical issue more than a mental health issue.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's an interesting take. What kind of inspired you to want to take that approach, if you don't mind? That's really interesting.
I think that in Madagascar, there are like a few research that really focused on mental health. I mean, like most of the research are focused on over disease or like diarrhea, malaria, and over disease, but there are like few research that really address mental health in Madagascar. That's a topic that I think have been a little bit ignored, though in the place where I'm from, people starting experiencing like depression, anxiety, stress, and I think we need to include that as a part of the research because yes, I agree we need to deal with malaria, diarrhea, and other disease, but that's mental health issue is another problem now in Madagascar that we need to deal with. So I'm really interested in that part because again, like that research is not it's very under researched in my country. So I try to see how food and environmental change, seasonality are interlinked so on mental health. So that's something I really want to see and to go deeper.
Mhm. It's really interesting, and it's something I think a lot of people have been thinking about over the last year, especially during the pandemic, is mental health and making sure you take care of your mental health, and it is something that does need to be looked into more. So it is a very kind of interesting topic and something that I'll definitely be keeping up to date with. To involve coral reefs, which is one love, and then mental health, which is another interest of mine, is it's an interesting combination of things that yes, I'll be very intrigued to see what the results of that kind of study are and what you find out. It's really interesting, really, really interesting. Yes, I guess though, sadly, that brings us to the end of our conversation. And I wanted to ask before we go, if people do want to keep up to date with these projects, such as your work with mental health, or on the kind of coral reefs, or on wildlife, or the chickens, or on anything, where is the best place to kind of keep up to date with all of the work that you're doing?
So we have a website that
Mhm.
we could check, www.mahery.org. That's the website of Madagascar Health and Environmental Research, and you could find all of our research project in that website. It's www.mahery.org. So you can find all of our past project and current project in that website. You can also go on Facebook and just type Madagascar Health and Environmental Research. So you'll get the most news about like our latest publication, over news or videos or everything related to our work. So we have like our website and we have our Facebook page, and you could also check on Instagram. It's also Madagascar Health and Environmental Research. And also, if you really want to see most of our work, you could also check on Professor Chris Golden page, because there you can find all of our research in his website. So those are all the places or link where we could find our work.
Perfect. And I guess my very, very final question for you then, I'll make sure to put links to all of those in the description of the episode so people can find them as well. And I guess my final question would be, if there's someone sitting at home who has followed you on all those things and is kind of still wants to do more to help out and help your research or support conservation and kind of development work in Madagascar, what would your advice to them be? What can they do to kind of yeah, what would your piece of advice for them be if they want to kind of be more involved than just following the information?
They could be more involved, like supporting all NGOs in Madagascar that are doing work.
Mhm.
So, for instance, on Madagascar Health and Environmental Research, you could like get in touch with us, and also we could introduce you to some maybe NGOs that has a specific project on something that people may have some interest. And also, if you really want to do some work in conservation in Madagascar, I think the key is to really understand the communities. You could not only go there and just implement your project, but you need to learn their culture. You need to talk with them, because sometimes what you think is right is not right to them. So you need to try to find that balance, because you cannot just, okay, this is a really good project, let's go and just let's implement this. But you need to learn, and we need to live with those communities and to really understand what they really need to want in their village or in their place. And so you could really understand what they need, how you could support them, because sometimes we just see like outside, okay, I want to do this, I want to do this, and then once you arrive at the community, we don't really know the culture of those communities. So my advice is, before you really try to implement a project, even conservation project in Madagascar, just go meet with those local communities, understand their perspective, to learn about their culture, what they want, and you need also to explain about your perspective. So I think that my big key if you really want to do work in Madagascar.
Perfect. Well, I think that's a really interesting. It gives people a lot to think about going away from the episode. And yes, it's excellent advice. I think to really do your research and learn about what you want to help and what you want to do before you do it. So thank you. Yes, thank you so much for that, and thank you for everything else and all of your other insights. It's been really fascinating to listen to you today and hear all about the many different projects that you're working on. So thank you so much.
Thank you again for having me, Jack. And yes, it was a great discussion. and also I was able to discuss about my work, about our work, and yes, thank you again.
Perfect. Thank you so, so much. And we are back. Thank you so, so much for listening to today's show. And thank you, of course, to Hervé for his incredible insights and for bringing up topics that somehow are linked, even though they look completely disparate when you put them on paper. They were all fascinating and fantastic, and I really appreciated talking about them, especially touching on mental health. I think given the last year of pandemic and everything that's gone on, mental health is so important and something that I'm really glad we got a chance to talk about on a podcast that isn't typically focused on mental health or human health at all. It's something that I'm really glad we got to talk about. So thank you so much, Hervé, for bringing that up and bringing the information in. And I really hope all of you listening enjoyed that as well. Now, that brings us to the end of today's show. Hervé will actually be back on Friday, so if you're interested in learning more about his work, we're going to talk about community conservation and government collaboration on Friday, so make sure to tune back in for that. And make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on any of the future episodes we have coming up. We have stuff on baobabs and education and empowering women and all sorts of really interesting topics that I think, like mental health, you wouldn't necessarily associate with conservation right away, but are really, really interesting, and I can't wait for you all to listen to. You can also follow us on your social media platforms of choice, whether that be Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. We're on them all at Pangolin Podcast, so make sure to get us on there as well. Anyway, thank you all so much for listening. That brings us to the end of today's show. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you for listening. I've said that already, but thank you. And thank you for joining us as we explore the land of the lemurs. Bye bye.